Hello, this is my final reflection project for English 147. To begin, we're going to go over the course objectives that I will reference throughout this presentation. In this course, we were expected to identify principles of rhetorical and logical reasoning, particularly surrounding STEM arguments. We were also supposed to analyze and compose arguments of facts and value, as well as arguments that advocate on issues of social import. We should be able to compose texts in different genres in multiple medias for diverse audiences, and engage with the ethical and cultural dimensions of an argument, as well as be able to evaluate the credibility of evidence when we're reconstructing arguments. We're going to go over some of the 4 course touchstone materials that we will also reference throughout this presentation, to begin with the science literacy slides, which define science literacy as the ability to understand specific concepts well enough to make informed decisions that benefit oneself and society. There are 5 types of science literacy that were discussed: civil, cultural, practical, aesthetic, and consumer. Civil literacy is when you use science in government, legislation, and public policy, for example, things like climate legislation. Cultural literacy is understanding scientific knowledge shared in society. So, for example, the function of vaccines. Practical science literacy is applying science to daily activities and hands-on problem solving, like permaculture or nutrition science. Aesthetic science literacy is not as common, but it's still important, and that would be when one evaluates when appreciates scientific beauty and natural phenomenon, such as petrichor or other natural patterns that appear in our math and science day-to-day lives. And finally, consumer science literacy is evaluating products using specific scientific reasoning, like claims surrounding essential oils or supplementals, things like that. These slides emphasized that science literacy supports informed citizenship and ethical decision-making, and it notes that literacy is context-based. Personal, public, civil, all of those types of science literacy, their applications matter equally, and they depend heavily on the context. And finally, it highlights the need for accessible science education to foster democratic participation. If we take a deeper look at this idea that scientific education is necessary for science literacy, which is necessary for democratic participation, we will come to a discussion similar to the one being had in Chakravarty's scientific knowledge article. This article distinguishes scientific knowledge, like facts, models, and theories, from the knowledge of science, which is the understanding of how science works. It claims that public understanding is essential for policy decisions and democratic societies, similar to the science literacy materials. Furthermore, it identifies 2 obstacles to public understanding, such as intrinsic and extrinsic challenges. Intrinsic challenges are things like the fact that science is complex, technical, and difficult for non-experts to fully grasp or understand. Extrinsic challenges being that political and corporate interests often distort or misrepresent science. The article goes on to critique the 2 most common forms of science literacy, narrow and broad. Narrow literacy focuses on content, but is too difficult to scale to the whole public, whereas broad literacy focuses on philosophy or method, but it is too abstract for most people to understand. This article introduces a solution, namely philosophical literacy, which is understanding that science as a problem-solving tool for human action. It argues that the public needs to know why science works more than they need to know every detail of how it works. The article also discusses knowledge transfer and the difficulty of translating scientific concepts for society. In conclusion, the article decides that education should emphasize science practical successes, things like vaccines, food availability, and technology, to build trust and support in scientific policies. Ashwandan's Science Isn't Broken article claims that science is not broken but messy, reflecting on how knowledge evolves over time. It emphasizes the self-correcting nature of science despite replication crises and public mistrust. It explains how scientists explore hypotheses, run multiple statistical tests, and revise their findings over time. It also shows how data analysis is influenced by variability, sample size, and interpretation choices. and warns that the media and public misunderstandings often oversimplify and can sensationalize scientific results. The article argues that transparency, open data, and replication efforts actually strengthen science rather than weaken it, and highlights that uncertainty is natural and not evidence of failure. Finally, the article encourages readers to understand that science works instead of expecting perfect and definitive answers. In the scientific reasoning article, the author claims that all science aims to know. The scientific method is also briefly discussed in this article, and that begins with observation, which leads to questions and hypotheses, and goes through many steps until one arrives at an analysis and experiments that either accept or reject their hypothesis. This article mainly delves into two types of scientific reasoning, inductive and deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning goes from specific observations to general conclusions. It's common in descriptive science. For example, when one looks at brain scans, they have multiple observations of which areas are active, and that leads them to a general conclusion about the function of the brain. Deductive reasoning goes from general principles and narrows to specific predictions. This is used mostly in hypothesis-driven research. For example, if one begins with the general principle of climate change and global warming, they can narrow that further to predict shifts in plant and animal distribution due to the negative consequences of climate change. The article also discusses two main pathways of scientific study. The descriptive discovery science, which observes, explores, and discovers, is a type of inductive science reasoning. And hypothesis-based science, which is mainly deductive, begins with a question and a testable hypothesis. This is what we often see as the scientific method. In real life, however, the boundary between inductive and deductive reasoning is blurred because real science is a blend of both. This is my first screenshot taken from my report for advocacy written to the superintendent. In this blurb, I discuss how curriculum implementation can fall short in regards to institutional opposition teachers have and their internal competing commitments. I specifically talk about teachers' beliefs about what teaching should look like, fears about relinquishing control in the classroom, or assumptions about student abilities that can lead to resistance implementing curriculum changes. I go further by talking about the immunity to change model and other tactics that can help teachers overcome these competing commitments. Science Isn't Broken discusses how good intentions or personal diligence do not automatically translate into high-quality science. Systemic reform is necessary to create real, lasting impact. Similarly, resources and training alone do not guarantee successful implementation. Cultural, institutional, and emotional factors shape behavior. Teachers may have good intentions, same as scientists in regards to p-hacking, but that does not always translate into good teaching methods because of their internal biases. When proposing particular solutions to this problem, I had to take into consideration possible objections. This aligns with the idea of knowledge of science from Scientific Knowledge article, recognizing that science doesn't exist in a vacuum and that successful outcomes depend on understanding the social, institutional, and human context in which science interacts with society, which is why I suggested incentivizing teachers to reform their curricula instead of mandating it, and providing resources to help teachers identify their internal competing biases and overcome them in hopes of successful curriculum implementation and growth in student progress. Identifying and understanding the ethical and cultural dynamics of my argument were very important to me throughout this project. Here, I addressed institutional cultural resistance rooted in ideas of supremacy of traditional education, teacher identity and fears, and the ethics of autonomy, professional respect, and fair incentives, as well as the importance of equitable, effective curriculum implementation, and the ethical responsibility of institutions to provide support and training to ensure all the work does not unfairly fall on teachers' shoulders. Because I was able to come up with these claims of value, I saw that all science-based strategies in the world would fail if they weren't implemented successfully. and I was able to incorporate them into my solutions to the superintendent. Because I started by searching for the ethical and cultural counter-arguments, I was able to make strong value claims and apply them in my argument for a STEM advocacy project that addresses social issues. One problem I faced in this section of my research was that I actually only considered the opposition of parents, school boards, and students when implementing new curriculum until the very late stages of my report. It actually wasn't until we discussed it in office hours that I began to think about teachers' own objections and hesitations when it came to top-down curriculum reform. I was able to overcome this setback when I found the Tucker article, Why Teachers Struggle to Change and How the Immunity to Change Model Can Help, which showed me the teachers' important objectives and perspectives, as well as ways to encourage change in the minds of educators. This screenshot was taken from my fact claims assignment, and it discusses a particular article, the Gandel article, about math needs in the workforce and how schools can adjust their math teaching and curricula in order to connect more directly with the workforce. Here I analyzed the fact claims that the article made, as well as prepared to use them in my own writing. I talked about how it was important to understand the societal impact of our current math teaching strategies as a way for us to understand why it is so important to update these curricula. Here I was applying practical science literacy, which focuses on taking scientific knowledge or research and translating it for practical use. In his article, Scientific Knowledge or Knowledge of Science, Anjan Chakravarty proposed looking at science with a form of philosophical literacy that focuses on the capacity of science and its uses and effects on human action. Using this article, which argues that math education should not merely exist for academic mastery and should instead equip students with the skills to act effectively in the modern workforce, I took it a step further and argued that the best way to maximize the data on the decline of math proficiency and the benefit of new math teaching strategies was to implement these in a way that would help all students trying to enter a variety of workforces, which is why there is such philosophical and societal impact of math education and why it needs to be changed. This argument was built off of a fact claim given by the Gandel article that traditional high school sequences do not prepare students for the workforce. I added on to this fact claim with another fact claim derived from other peer-reviewed articles on the negative effects of current math strategies, that students are disillusioned with pursuing math, which prevents them from acquiring math skills. These two fact claims I used oftentimes throughout this presentation, or throughout this excerpt and a later screenshot, which we will get to. Finally, I evaluated the credibility of my evidence. I used data and expert perspectives to justify claims about workforce needs and educational pathways, reflecting evidence-based argumentation. I also vetted this article. Because it was not a peer-reviewed journal article, I took that a step further, which meant reading laterally so that I could make sure that the author and the publishing site were credible and non-biased, which I found them to be. I also read upstream and followed the two examples Gandel referenced about ways to improve curriculums so they align with workforce needs. I didn't end up using either of those two sources, but I did find that Gandel ethically represented them both. This screenshot was taken from the conclusion section of my advocacy report. In this section, I changed to writing directly to the superintendent. I had been writing to him the entire time, but this was more upfront. I chose this because I felt that a conclusion where I was summarizing the policies that I wanted to see implemented would be most effective when addressing the superintendent very upfront and directly. In the science literacy slides, I learned that misunderstandings often come from communicators failing to consider what the audience already knows, what they need, and what they care about. The science literacy slides stressed science literacy not just as knowing science, but as knowing how to communicate science to non-experts, which is entirely an audience-centered activity, which is why I heavily considered my audience Mr. Superintendent Tony Thurmond. I knew from my research into Thurmond that he had chaired the Assemble Select Committee on STEM education. Therefore, I didn't try to over-explain why he should care about STEM education, because I assumed he already had some prior knowledge and he showed a demonstrated interest in STEM education. By writing my report directly to Thurmond, I was also practicing civil and consumer science literacy concepts, applying knowledge to inform policy and decisions. I adjusted my writing in this section because I was writing to the superintendent. I intentionally relied on a mix of ethos, pathos, and logos to strengthen my argument. I built ethos by appealing to his role and emphasizing that we share the same priority, supporting students, which helps establish myself as a credible, collaborative voice. I use pathos by highlighting how these curriculum changes directly impact students' well-being and opportunities and long-term success. At the same time, I ground my argument in logos by offering clear, realistic actions, like incentivizing teachers and reducing administrative burdens. So my position is supported by practical reasoning instead of just abstract claims. I also chose to keep this conclusion deliberately short because the report itself was lengthy and the superintendent is a busy man. I wanted to make sure that my points came across clear, concisely, and impactfully, and I found that the best way to do that was with a concise conclusion. This is my final screenshot, which is taken from my problem statement essay. Here is the application of the Gandel article that we were discussing earlier, as well as the Mervosh New York Times article. Here I am explaining exactly why we should care about math education and how it can impact society as a whole, particularly in workforce needs, and making sure that we have capable and competent mathematicians in the workforce. In this section, I use inductive reasoning. My argument moves from particular cases, observations about students, schools, and workforce demands, to a general statement about the need to evolve math education. My concrete observation included the types of math education needed in many jobs. The U.S. military had seen its My concrete observations included the types of math needed in many jobs, the U.S. military's test scores, and technical schools requiring remedial math classes. From there, I built a general conclusion that our math education system does not prepare students for the workforce and therefore needs to be evolved. When I examine this current state of math education, I see it as both a social and ethical issue. I use logos by presenting evidence about workforce needs, such as the importance of fractions for plumbers, declining scores on the military's tests, and I establish ethos. I establish ethos by quoting experts like Jeff Belanda and showing that my argument is grounded in credible sources. Finally, I appeal to pathos by highlighting how students' future opportunities are limited when they do not receive adequate preparation. I argue that addressing these gaps is not just a matter of individual learning, it's a societal necessity. Inadequate math education affects workforce readiness, economic outcomes, and students' ability to pursue fulfilling careers. I frame this as an ethical responsibility. Schools must ensure students are equipped with the skills they need to succeed, which is essential for fairness and for preparing the next generation to contribute meaningfully to society. By combining evidence, ethical reasoning, and appeals to shared values, I make a case for systemic education reform that benefits both students and the broader community. Moving into our big picture conversation. The 4 course touchstone materials each focus on different pieces of the scientific literacy puzzle, but they complement each other very well. They cover different aspects of scientific literacy. Science Isn't Broken examines the systemic issues and structural obstacles. Scientific reasoning focuses on the reasoning process scientists use. The science literacy slides show how to communicate science to different audiences. And scientific knowledge places science in a broader societal philosophical context. Together, they emphasize that science is not just knowledge, it's reasoning, communicating and applying knowledge responsibly in the real world. While the readings all complement each other very well, they also differ in their focus. Science Isn't Broken critiques the research system itself, whereas scientific reasoning teaches logical approaches for individual scientists. The science literacy slides focus on communicating science, and the knowledge versus knowledge of science emphasizes societal consequences. These differences create tension, showing that while science literacy has ideals, real-world science often faces its own limitations. Understanding these contrasts is key to grasping the full complexity of science in practice. Overall, these differences don't contradict. They highlight scientific literacy as a multi-layered system that cannot be reduced to just knowing facts. These readings also directly connect to our course objectives. They help me develop my skills in constructing arguments about facts, values, and policy. They reinforce the importance of audience-centered communication, as seen in the slides. Science Isn't Broken and knowledge of science push me to consider ethical, cultural, and societal impact. Overall, they support advocacy-oriented writing, critical evaluation that teaches evidence, reasoning, ethical awareness are all essential to responsible argumentation. Taken together, these texts expand our understanding of science literacy. They define it not just as scientific knowledge, but as reasoning, communication, and ethical awareness. They show that the consequences when science is poorly structured, miscommunicated, or applied without context. These readings collectively argue that scientific literacy is essential for evidence-based decision-making and social responsibility, emphasizing that science must be integrated into society thoughtfully to create meaningful change. Finally, the future applications. I can use the lessons from scientific reasoning and Science Isn't Broken to critically evaluate research and data. In college, this means analyzing articles, spotting biases, and constructing evidence-based arguments. In the workplace, it translates to making informed decisions and questioning assumptions instead of acting on intuition alone. From the science literacy slides and my conclusion written to the superintendent, I learned that knowing your audience is crucial. In college, I will write papers and presentations that fit the background and knowledge of my professors or peers. In professional settings, I can pitch ideas, present or advocate for projects in ways that align with stakeholders' needs. My work on curriculum implementation and workforce math needs has shown me that ethics and culture shape outcomes. I will carry this forward by ensuring that my research and decisions consider fairness, respect for diversity, and social impact. The STEM advocacy projects and math workforce discussions highlighted how evidence can be applied to drive change. I can use this skill to support initiatives in college or propose improvements in the workplace that have real-world social benefits. Combining insights from all 4 course readings and my own research helped me to synthesize ideas. I will continue this by connecting information from different courses or departments and solve complex problems by seeing patterns that others might miss. Finally, reflecting on my own writing and research has taught me to evaluate my work critically. I will keep using reflection to improve research, projects, and professional strategies in order to adapt to feedback and new challenges effectively. Thank you very much, and happy holidays.